Hi, good afternoon. This is Jeff Kassman, and welcome to Tradition. This is a series of interviews I'm conducting with my friend Jim DePiante on the issues that matter to people who are new to tradition, or perhaps you've been all around tradition for a long time, but you've always wondered about something and you didn't know who to ask. And you'd like to do things the right way. You'd like to understand the history behind why we do the things that we do. And that's what we're talking about on this podcast. Jim, welcome to the show again.
Thank you, Jeff. Glad to be here.
So just as a quick recap, in previous episodes, we've covered things like the basic principles for gestures and postures at Mass. We've talked about the various levels of solemnity at Mass and things like knowing when to sit and stand and kneel. And we've created a distinction, or rather we've observed the distinction that exists between what we're referring to as the sung Mass and the low Mass. And we're going to go into some more detail about those things eventually. On the last episode, we covered some really interesting things about fasting and abstinence. This is always an issue that Catholics are concerned with, but of course, as we're recording this, we're in the middle of Lent, so it's particularly appropriate. But also there are lots of issues that people have with fasting and abstinence, whether we follow the new rules or the old rules, what those rules even are. And why we Americans require so much extra help to get through periods of fasting and abstinence.
We're special, Jeff.
That's right. That's right. We've also talked a little bit about what's discretionary versus what the law requires, and why it's better to go above and beyond what the very bare minimum of the law is today. Now, Jim, would you kind of recap for us the basics, the principles of why we fast and abstain?
Sure enough. So the first reason is because we're sinful. And when we sin, we essentially create an imbalance of justice because we've not given God the honor that he's due. And so the first reason to do penance is to restore this balance, to now give God the honor that we denied him through our sinfulness. And that essentially is a matter of the natural law. But it's also by divine precept. Our Lord himself said, unless you do penance, you shall likewise perish. And so we do penance because we ought to, by the natural law. We do penance because our Lord said we must do penance, lest we perish. And we do penance because the church tells us to, but she tells us to essentially to fulfill divine precept and to fulfill the natural law.
All right. So what is the very bare minimum under pain of sin in terms of these penitential practices, according to the current law? I know we touched on this before, but people really do want to know. There's so much confusion out there, right? And you get different answers from everybody, including priests, unfortunately. What is the minimal requirement under the current law?
Sure. So the landscape changed in 1966 when Paul VI promulgated his apostolic constitution, Penance. This did away with the considerably more rigorous practices that were in the 1917 Code of Canon Law. The provisions of penance are now included in the 1983 Code of Canon Law. That requires that we abstain from eating meat on Ash Wednesday, on every Friday during the year. That, however, is dispensed. This Friday abstinence is dispensed even during Lent if a solemnity falls on a Friday. Now, the new calendar refers to what we used to call first-class feasts. What are called first-class feasts in the traditional calendar are referred to as solemnities in the new calendar. So if a solemnity falls on a Friday, even if that's during Lent, we're dispensed. And this is what binds us. We also must fast on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. Fast means we eat one main meal, two smaller meals, and we don't eat between meals. Current canon law says that the Episcopal conferences can determine more particular ways in which fasting and abstinence are to be observed. In the United States and in some other countries, the respective Episcopal conferences, actually shortly after Penance was released, legislated that Friday abstinence does not bind under pain of sin. which is interesting. So we're still required to do it, but there's no penalty for not doing it. And it's sort of a fundamental principle in all lawmaking that if you make a law that doesn't have a penalty associated with it, it's an unenforceable law. And in fact, you see what has happened, because abstinence, Friday abstinence, has completely fallen by the wayside. We don't even hear about it except during Lent.
Right. So some interesting observations, I think, just to make quickly. This Friday happens to be a solemnity. It's the Feast of the Assumption, or of the
Indeed.
Ascension. So, not the Ascension, Annunciation. So this is an example of a Friday where even during Lent, where under the current code, Catholics are dispensed from abstinence, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. In fact, we're going to talk about the specifics of that in just a moment.
Okay. And we've talked about how in the United States and probably many other places that the laws have been so diluted and so relaxed that it's almost, there's almost no pain of sin outside of Lent on Fridays, even though canon law still technically has this universal requirement. So what are we left with?
Not much, Jeff. I mean, fast and complete abstinence on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, and complete abstinence on the Fridays of Lent, unless there's a solemnity, which is not much.
Yeah, the church really does require so little of us. Of course, there's still lots of gnashing of teeth about abstaining during Lent. But you've said we're required to do penance lest we perish, right?
Those are our Lord's own words.
And many traditional Catholics, of course, are choosing to do more. They recognize that the more rigorous practices of antiquity, what our parents did and grandparents, what Catholics did for hundreds or thousands of years, actually are in our, it's to our benefit to do them. Like going to the gym is hard work, but it's good for us. You refer to these as the traditional practices. It's not necessarily strictly required by the law, but it's a good thing to do. They were in place before Paul VI's apostolic constitution, right?
Right.
So what were the provisions of those practices that for our conversations we're referring to as the traditional practices?
Well, in terms of what was done, the law of fasting was pretty much the same. The law of abstinence was likewise pretty much the same. What was very different was how many penitential days there were. So we're left with 2 days of fast and complete abstinence and 6 or fewer days of complete abstinence. In the past, prior to Pentimini, well, first observation, never on a Sunday. You neither fasted nor abstained on a Sunday. That was a day of feasting, not of fasting. But complete abstinence was obligatory on all Fridays. It was dispensed for a holy day of obligation outside of Lent. So if there was a holy day of obligation outside of Lent, you were dispensed. Not, however, if there's a holy day of obligation during Lent. Now, here in the United States, we don't have holy days of obligation during Lent, but in some countries, in Italy, where Feast of St. Joseph might be a holy day of obligation, that typically will occur during Lent. Likewise, in Ireland, the Feast of St. Patrick will occur during Lent, and that would be a holy day of obligation, or had been. And so those would not have been dispensed in any case. The other thing that's important is first-class feasts were never dispensed. So this idea of a solemnity being dispensed, even if it falls within Lent, that was out of the question. First-class feasts were not ever dispensed. So fasting and complete abstinence were obligatory on Ash Wednesday, on all Fridays and Saturdays in Lent, certainly on Good Friday, on Holy Saturday, on the Ember days being 4 days, spring, summer, winter, and fall, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, days given over to Thanksgiving and to petition, complete fast and complete abstinence, then various vigils. Eventually that was changed to include only 2 vigils, the vigil of Pentecost and the vigil of Christmas. So it's worth noting that all fast days were days of either complete abstinence, which is to say no meat, or days of partial abstinence, which is to say meat once and only at the main meal. So fasting and partial abstinence were obligatory on Monday through Thursday during Lent. Fasting and partial abstinence obligatory Monday through Thursday during Lent. Friday and Saturday during Lent were fast and complete abstinence. And of course, on Sunday, there were no penitential practices, no fasting, no abstinence. Very different, very different.
Vast differences. Now, given that the current practices are so lax, should anyone assume that the traditional practices bind in any way under pain of sin, penalty of sin?
They absolutely do not. The 1983 code is what binds us all. We may call ourselves traditionalists, but we are bound morally by the 1983 Code of Canon Law because we are Catholic after all. We are not, however. So the 1983 code may dispense us from so many of the more traditional practices. We are not dispensed from the natural law nor from divine positive law. Unless you do penance, you shall likewise perish. Unfortunately, we're now on our own to do penance so as not to perish.
It's almost like Mother Church is kind of an absent parent in terms of what's in the best interest of our souls. So it's falling back on us to kind of step up and do what we know we need to do.
Well, that's the idea. Unfortunately, in practice, that's not our first choice. I mean, as I pointed out in last episode, we're weak, we're a little bit lazy, we tend to procrastinate, and we're not particularly hard on ourselves. And so it was good for us to have the church insist under penalty of sin that we do these things. Now we have to do them ourselves.
Now, I think it's important at this point. We spent a lot of time talking about penitential practices, but Lent is not just about penitential practices. It's about prayer and almsgiving. So, but with respect to the penitential practices, what else can we do? What would traditionalists of the past do?
The first and obvious choice is to adopt for ourselves, as a matter of resolution, the pre-penitentiary practices, essentially what's codified in the 1917 Code of Canon Law, what we refer to as the traditional practices. We can do other things in terms of self-denial as well. Less social media time, less television, things often denigrated, but they shouldn't be denigrated. Give up sweets, chocolate, bourbon, beer, coffee, whatever. Deny ourselves lawful pleasures so as to become stronger, essentially to do training in little things so that when the time comes to deny ourselves against unlawful things or big things, we're in good shape to do that. So yeah, these practices are often denigrated. They shouldn't be.
So I would say, Jim, thank you for that kind of recap, catching us up from the last episode. I would encourage people who are listening at this point, if you've not watched episode 5, go back and look at that because we did a deep dive into all of these issues. So let's move on from there. Questions come up all the time about how to implement these, what we're calling the traditional practices. What's the best way for people to know what's going on, what's expected of them, and when?
Without a doubt, the single most important thing you must do, but you need to do this in any case, is have conveniently located a current traditional calendar. You really can't understand what's going on in terms of the liturgy, in terms of fast and abstinence, without a traditional calendar. The practices themselves are in conformance with the 1962 Missale Romanum, and that will be reflected in a 1962 version of the calendar. It will tell you the penitential days. It will tell you what is required on those days, whether it's fast with complete abstinence, fast with partial abstinence, or just abstinence. So a liturgical calendar, and then it's handy to always have easy access to your hand missal. in conformance with the 1962 altar missal.
And again, for folks who maybe did not listen to the previous episode, we talked about what all these distinction means, even the distinctions that are no longer binding under the law, what partial abstinence and complete abstinence and fasting, what all that actually means. So if you've not seen it, go back to episode 5. Now, some common questions, Jim, that come up whenever we talk about fast and abstinence. What about the person who says, well, actually, there's 2 ways to look at this. Some people say, well, I actually really like fish. Is that a penance? I love fish of all kinds. And then we've got other people who absolutely hate fish. So is that their penance, just having something they hate? Could you talk about the point of these penitential practices and how that reflects in these different situations?
So if you just, I mean, there are some people who just cannot abide fish, but the rule is not that you eat fish. The rule is that you not eat meat. There are a lot of other things that you can do. So do those things. If you're one of those who really likes seafood, and oh, by the way, I really do. It is not a penance for me to eat seafood. I just had the most marvelous fish taco. Keep in mind that there are 2 things behind a penitential practice. The first is to mortify the senses, and the second is to mortify the will. Now, it's an interesting term, mortify. Mortify means to cause the death of. And what is it? We're trying to cause the death to self and selfish interests. So this mortification, the thing we're trying to mortify, the thing we're trying to kill, are the passions, the senses, what we enjoy eating as an example, but much more importantly, the will. And so even if we love eating seafood, we still have the opportunity to do what's actually considerably more important, and that is to mortify the will and to eat the thing that we enjoy in a spirit of obedience and humility. So it may not be painful, but again, the purpose of penance is as much to sort of inflict an injury on the will as much as the body.
Yeah, that obedience. Sometimes obedience is easy, right? And sometimes obedience is hard.
Sometimes it's not, but it's still meritorious.
Yeah, absolutely. Now the question,
in fact, when we've sort of reached the pinnacle of sanctity, obedience is always easy. I'm not there yet.
yeah. All right. So the question has been asked. Someone says, I observe the traditional practices. This year, 2022, the solemnity of the Annunciation falls on a Friday in Lent. Is it a sin if I eat meat? This is what we were talking about earlier.
Sure. There's the question comes up pretty much every Lent. And there's just a whole lot that's wrong with it. So first observation, objectively, it's not a sin to eat meat because it being a solemnity, we're dispensed. So according to the 1983 Code of Canon Law, we're not required to abstain from meat on that day. But I want to be very, very precise. It is a sin if you think it is, all right? So if your conscience is malformed and you actually believe it's wrong and you eat the meat, notwithstanding that you believe it's wrong, that actually is a sin because it's a violation of your conscience, and it's a very fundamental teaching that the conscience must be supreme. We must follow our conscience, even if it's mistaken. So that said, if you are following the traditional practices, then you use the 1962 liturgical calendar. And on the 1962 liturgical calendar, there are no solemnities. They're called first-class feasts. So if you ask, well, the feast, you're following traditional practices, you say the solemnity of the Annunciation falls on a Friday, the first thing you want to know is it's not the solemnity, it's the first-class feast of the Annunciation, and solemnities are dispensed according to the new rules, and that's what morally binds us under pain of sin. But first-class feasts never dispensed according to the old rules, and holy days of obligation did not dispense during Lent according to the old rules. So are you following the old rules or are you following the new rules? If you're following the new rules, you're dispensed. If you're following the old rules, there is no dispensation, but you're dispensed anyways because you're doing this of your own volition. So is it a sin? you're following the old rules voluntarily, and you're not bound morally to follow them. They do not bind under pain of sin. The new rules apply, and you're dispensed. So it's not a sin. Absolutely not.
And you made a great point about the sin of violating your conscience. So if you had someone who thought that these rules did apply to them, the old rules, that is to say, and they ate the meat anyway, then they have in fact committed a sin,
Right.
Probably a mortal sin, right?
Probably a mortal sin.
Yeah.
Well, under the conditions,
Right.
grave matter. It certainly is grave matter. You think it's a mortal sin. You do it knowingly and the full consent of the will. It would in fact be a mortal sin. Yes.
And so you'd be obliged to confess that. And
Confess
then
that, absolutely.
And then what's going to happen, of course, is they're going to confess that they ate meat on that Friday. And the priest is going to say, no, you're confused. It's not a sin. And you're going to have the penitent is going to have a conversation with that confessor to say, well, I recognize that I was mistaken, but I violated my conscience. And unfortunately, in a lot of places, for people that are new to tradition, they might be going to a priest who's probably going to struggle with that.
Who's not dialed into such subtleties.
Yeah. So just one more way the crisis is a challenge for us. Okay, so in general, if I decide to follow the old rules and I violate the old rules, but I don't violate the new rules, is it a sin?
Objectively, absolutely not. And again, subjectively, if you think it is, it is. It's important at this point also to make a distinction between a vow and a resolution. So a vow is a solemn promise made to God. And it is possible in making a vow to intend fully to bind yourself under penalty of sin and even mortal sin. It would thus be a sin. But you don't make such vows without the advice of your confessor. And it's important to understand a resolution is not a vow. Now, we probably shouldn't, we absolutely should not, without the advice of a confessor, be making a vow to follow the old rules. We can, but you want to engage your confessor to do that. What we're doing is making a resolution, and it's never a sin to violate a resolution. So we're constrained, obligated, bound morally under pain of sin to abide by the new rules, not by the old. Those are no more than a resolution. And again, I will reiterate, it is not a sin to break a resolution.
Does the same principle apply for these self-imposed mortifications, right? People, a very good practice, go above and beyond even what the old traditions were in terms of the law, and they give up other things, and then inevitably they fall, right? Does the same principle you've been explaining apply to those self-imposed mortifications?
Absolutely. These are resolutions, not vows. So if you resolve not to eat chocolate during Lent, and you do, no sin. On the other hand, if you eat anything between meals on Good Friday or Ash Wednesday, anything between meals, that would be a sin, because those are binding days of fast and complete abstinence. So self-imposed mortifications do not bind because they're resolutions. They're not vows, which can bind us, and they're not laws, which do absolutely bind us.
So let's give an example. What if I'm Irish and I gave up whiskey for Lent? Can I get a dispensation and drink whiskey on St. Patrick's Day?
You don't need one. It's at your own discretion. You made the resolution. You can dispense yourself from it.
That's simple.
It's that simple.
All right. What about on Sundays? The church never requires that we fast or abstain on Sundays. Can a person make a resolution to do some penance on Sundays? For example, I know of religious orders that they never eat meat, right? It's just a perpetual, part of their vows, I guess, or maybe part of the resolution, but
Part of the rule.
Yeah, part of the rule that they live by. They never eat meat. And so a person says, oh, I love that. And so they're going to give up meat, for example, for the entirety of Lent. Can a person make that kind of resolution to do some sort of penance even on Sundays?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
and then could a person, we just got to follow it down the rabbit hole, right? Can a person then, after having made that resolution, can they dispense themselves?
Sure. So you can resolve to do that. You can dispense yourself, but you can also make the resolution to do that 6 days a week or 1 day a week. I mean, it's your resolution. Do what you like. And so a resolution is in a way sort of making a non-binding law for yourself. And a dispensation per se needs to come from the lawgiver. So you're the lawgiver, the law giveth, the law can take it away. So make a resolution you think you can keep and keep it to the extent you can, but you don't sin if you don't keep it.
I've got another question. How about outside of Lent? I live in the United States. I'm following the traditional practices, and a solemnity falls on a Friday. Now what? Am I dispensed?
You're off the hook for a lot of reasons. So if you're following the traditional rules, you want to follow the traditional calendar. It's typical. Yes, a solemnity on the new calendar is a first class feast on the old. It may or may not be a holy day of obligation. So a solemnity typically is a first class feast on the old calendar, but not every solemnity is a holy day of obligation. You would have been dispensed outside of Lent on the old calendar, according to the old rules, if it were a holy day of obligation. You're not dispensed for a first class feast and not a holy day of obligation if it comes during Lent. But you're still only morally bound by the new rules. So you're off the hook, as it were, for three different reasons. First, your resolution to follow the old rules doesn't bind, so you don't need to be dispensed. Second, Fridays in the United States outside of Lent do not bind under penalty of sin in any case, so there's nothing to be dispensed from. And finally, the solemnity dispenses you from the non-existent requirement in the United States to fast or abstain on a Friday. So you're already dispensed. So it's old rules, you wouldn't have been, but you're bound by the new rules. It's outside of Lent. And so there's no obligation, there's no penalty for not abstaining. So effectively you're dispensed. And the solemnity dispenses you from this non-existent requirement in any case. On the other hand, unless you do penance, you shall likewise perish. So choose wisely.
What about, we get a lot of questions about women, of course, women who are expecting, they're pregnant, or they're nursing. Are they dispensed from fasting?
Okay, the first thing again to keep in mind is the old laws are not binding in any case. The new laws in the United States only require fasting on 2 days and abstinence on those 2 days, plus 6, perhaps 5 others. Strictly speaking, a dispensation must come from a superior. So a parish priest, a confessor can dispense, the bishop can dispense, the pope can dispense. You don't need a dispensation, but there's a principle that says no law ever obliges if it adversely affects health. That is true of all the laws in the church. If it has an adverse effect on your health, it doesn't oblige. Now, the mother is obviously responsible for her own health and the health of the baby and her children. And so no dispensation is required. One is excused, not dispensed, and one is absolutely permitted to make this determination for oneself. Now, if you have any apprehension about that, seek the advice of a priest. But that apprehension should only ever in any case involve the 2 days of fast, Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, and those very few days when abstinence is required under penalty of sin.
Is the same question regarding pregnant women or nursing mothers, is the same principle regarding abstinence?
Absolutely. Same principles. Old laws aren't binding in any case. No law, old or new, ever obliges if it adversely affects health. One is excused and need not seek a dispensation. You are permitted to make that determination for yourself or on behalf of those for whom you are responsible. If you have any question, simply get the advice of a good traditional priest.
So regarding what binds and what does not, current regulations bind under penalty of sin. The traditional regulations that many trads want to embrace, those are voluntary, and so they don't bind under penalty of sin. Other personal resolutions do not bind, and we are excused from any law that would adversely affect our health, and that decision is made by the individual. Did I get it all right?
That's it. That's a good recap.
Okay, well, to conclude, one final question. On those days which bind under penalty of sin, according to the new rules, what about imitation meat?
It's not meat. Though for me, eating this stuff would be a penance, but I will now take the opportunity to cite what is now a very famous line from Angelus magazine with respect to soy chorizo. Soy chorizo, despite being an abomination in the eyes of the Lord, contains as much swine as a bowl full of kale.
That's a great line. I think a lot of people didn't appreciate that somebody there actually has a sense of humor. I appreciated it. But it has led to other questions. Do you think trads have said, well, is there a sin of scandal involved if I go to a restaurant on a Friday of Lent and my colleagues know that I'm a Catholic and they know that I abstain from meat on Fridays, and then they witness me order this, what appears to be a burger? Am I committing some sin of scandal there, even if technically it's not meat?
It's at least theoretically possible. The idea being, does it have some probability to induce another to sin? So to have someone think incorrectly about the Catholic faith that doesn't, a Protestant, for example, who's not bound to fast or abstain according to church law, they're certainly bound to, lest they perish, but it wouldn't be a sin for a non-Catholic to eat meat on Friday. So if, however, another Catholic who knows they're bound sees a person who is ostensibly a good Catholic eating what they think is meat, there is genuinely a possibility of scandal, theoretically. Absolutely.
And so if you think you've done that, if you're the penitent and you think that you've committed the sin of scandal, you mention the circumstances and confession, and you let your priest deal with it.
Right.
Okay, well, Jim, thank you. I think that concludes our episode today. Frankly, I'm ready to move off of all this talk of fasting and abstinence. So let's, in our next episode, let's kind of get back to the liturgical schema that we were following and look at what the faithful do with respect to standing, sitting, and kneeling at the different liturgies, and make the necessary distinctions between low mass and sung mass. We've kind of touched on that already. And then some more distinctions that are going to be necessary for a solemn mass. And then let's talk about one very important distinction for a pontifical mass, whether it's low or solemn. Jim, anything else that you would like to add?
Just would like to make one quick observation. Was speaking to a lovely woman at church last Friday after stations. And she was asking questions, interestingly, about what to do at Mass. And I told her that I had not seen her at the sung Mass. And she said, well, I'm not ready to go to that yet. I've only gone to the low Mass because I don't have any idea what I would do at the sung Mass. And my advice to her was, watch the podcast and find a nice lady in the church and sit next to her.
Yeah, pretty good rule of thumb to follow. All right, Jim, thank you as always, and we'll see you next on the next episode.
My pleasure, Jeff, and God bless you.
God bless you.